Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt and inspiring tales that capture the essence of the human experience. Today, we bring you the story of Emily, a courageous mother navigating the trials of betrayal, loss, and rebuilding her life for the sake of her son, Ethan. Through resilience, love, and the support of those who believe in her, Emily discovers her inner strength and a renewed sense of hope. Join us as we unfold this moving journey that proves even in our darkest moments, there's light to be found. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. Hello, and welcome. Today, I want to share a story that moved me deeply, a story about love, heartbreak, and resilience in the face of unimaginable challenges. It's a tale of Emily, a woman whose strength and determination in the face of adversity left an indelible mark on my heart. Emily had always been a devoted wife and mother. Her life revolved around her husband, James, and their 5-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan wasn't like other children, he had cerebral palsy, a condition that required constant care and attention. Emily had embraced this challenge with a quiet resolve, pouring all her energy into making Ethan's life as comfortable and joyful as possible. But beneath her calm exterior, Emily carried the weight of her family's struggles alone. One day, everything changed. James came home late, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a sadness that Emily hadn't seen before. She immediately sensed something was wrong. But when she asked, he didn't respond. Instead, he sat down, his hands trembling as he held a crumpled piece of paper. Emily watched as he struggled to find the words, her own heart beginning to race. Finally, he spoke. "Mom passed away," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with sorrow. Emily's mind reeled. Eleanor, James' mother, had been a lively, spirited woman who seemed invincible despite her age. Her sudden death felt like an impossibility. The days that followed were a blur. Emily tried to comfort James, but he withdrew into himself, shutting her out completely. She managed the funeral arrangements, ensuring that Eleanor's neighbors and friends in her small Vermont village could pay their respects. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by people whose lives Eleanor had touched in her quiet, unassuming way. As Emily stood by James' side, she couldn't help but feel the growing distance between them. After the funeral, James announced that they needed to go to Eleanor's house to sort through her belongings. The journey to the village was long and silent. James stared out the car window, lost in his thoughts, while Emily focused on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that they would get through this together. But something held her back. She had seen this side of James before, after his father's death years ago, when grief had driven him to the brink of self-destruction. Back then, she had tried to pull him out of his despair, only to be met with anger and rejection. This time, she decided to tread carefully, hoping he would find his way out on his own. When they arrived at Eleanor's house, James hesitated at the gate. The peeling paint and rusted hinges told a story of their own, a story of a family home that had seen better days but still held countless memories. James stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumped, before finally pushing the gate open. The familiar creak of the hinges seemed to echo through the quiet yard, a sound that brought tears to his eyes. Inside, the house was just as James had left it years ago. The walls were yellowed from his father's smoking habit, and the furniture bore the marks of time. Yet, despite its imperfections, the house had a warmth that was undeniable. Emily could see the nostalgia in James' eyes as he walked through each room, his fingers grazing the walls as if to reconnect with his past. They began sorting through Eleanor's belongings, a task that proved to be both physically and emotionally exhausting. James was distant, his mind elsewhere, while Emily tried to focus on the practicalities. As she sifted through old photographs and faded documents, she caught glimpses of a life well lived: Eleanor's youth, her marriage, her years as a mother, It was a bittersweet reminder of the passage of time and the fragility of life. Among the items they found were James' childhood keepsakes, school diplomas, photo albums, and even a diary he had kept as a teenager. Emily couldn't help but smile as she flipped through the pages, imagining the boy James used to be before life had burdened him with so much pain. But James barely acknowledged these mementos. His focus elsewhere. That night, as they packed up the last of the bags, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She looked at James, who sat silently on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that she was there for him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned off the lights and went to bed, hoping that tomorrow would bring some sense of clarity or peace. But peace was elusive. The next day, James was colder, more distant than ever. Emily could feel him slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. All she could do was hold on to the hope that, somehow, they would find their way back to each other. Little did she know, their journey was only just beginning, and the challenges ahead would test her strength and resilience in ways she could never have imagined. The drive back from Eleanor's house was as quiet as the one there, but the silence felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Emily stole glances at James, whose jaw was clenched tight as he stared out the window. She wanted to ask what was on his mind, but after years of marriage, she knew when he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, she focused on the road, her thoughts racing with worry. Something about this grief felt different, more destructive. Once home, they unloaded the bags of Eleanor's belongings into the apartment. Emily placed them in a corner of the living room, thinking she'd sort through them later. Ethan, their 5-year-old son, greeted them with his usual sweet smile. Though he was confined to his wheelchair, Emily scooped him up, kissing his forehead and holding him close. In that moment, she felt her resolve strengthen. Whatever happened, she would protect him. James, however, barely acknowledged Ethan. He muttered something about needing to lie down and disappeared into the bedroom. Emily's heart sank as she watched him retreat. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with innocent eyes, and she forced a smile, determined not to let her son see her sadness. As the days passed, James became increasingly withdrawn. He spent hours sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but not really watching. He barely spoke to Emily, and his interactions with Ethan were limited to the occasional distracted pat on the head. It was as if a wall had gone up between them, and Emily didn't know how to break it down. She tried to give him space, hoping he would open up in his own time, but as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that James wasn't just grieving, he was slipping away. He began coming home late, smelling faintly of alcohol. At first, Emily convinced herself that it was just a coping mechanism, a way for him to deal with his mother's death. But deep down, she feared it was more than that. One night, Emily decided to confront him. She waited until Ethan was asleep, then sat down beside James on the couch. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the flickering television screen. "James," she began softly, "we need to talk." He sighed heavily but didn't respond. "I know you're hurting," she continued, her voice trembling. "I am too. But shutting me out isn't going to help. We're a family. James. We need to face this together." He finally turned to her, his expression blank. "You don't understand," he said flatly. Emily's chest tightened. "Then help me understand," she pleaded. "I want to be here for you. I want to help." James shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You can't help, Emily. You've never been able to. I need something else." Her stomach dropped at his words, and for the first time, she felt the cold grip of fear. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But James didn't answer. He stood up abruptly and walked into the bedroom, leaving Emily sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, her heart pounding. The next morning, James came into the kitchen as Emily was feeding Ethan. He looked at her with a strange mix of determination and detachment. "I'm leaving," he said bluntly. Emily froze, the spoon in her hand hovering over Ethan's bowl. "What?" she managed to say. "I can't do this anymore," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I need space. I need to figure things out." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "James, please don't do this. We can work through this together. Ethan needs you." James flinched at the mention of their son's name but shook his head. "I've made up my mind." As he packed his belongings, Emily followed him from room to room, begging him to stay. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. When he finally walked out the door, carrying a duffel bag and wearing a look of grim determination, Emily felt her world collapse. She stood there in the hallway, holding Ethan close as tears streamed down her face. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she whispered to her son, her voice shaking. "Daddy will come back. He just needs time." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Emily spent the next few days in a fog of despair. She went through the motions of caring for Ethan, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of her marriage and wondering where it had all gone wrong. She told herself she needed to stay strong for her son, but the pain of James' betrayal was almost too much to bear. It wasn't until she stumbled upon Eleanor's will while sorting through the bags from the Vermont house that she found a glimmer of hope, a small reminder that even in the darkest times, life has a way of surprising us. As Emily sat on the floor surrounded by bags of Eleanor's belongings, her heart was heavy with grief and uncertainty. She was sorting through the remnants of a life, faded photographs, handwritten notes, and small trinkets that spoke of moments long past. Ethan was in his wheelchair nearby, quietly watching her with his gentle gaze. Emily spoke to him occasionally, explaining what she was doing in a bright tone, but her voice wavered under the weight of her emotions. It was during this task that she came across an old photo album. The leather cover was worn, the corners frayed, but it held a certain charm. As Emily flipped through the pages, she found photographs of a younger Eleanor, her husband, and a boy she instantly recognized as James. She paused on a picture of James as a teenager, standing proudly in a suit at his high school graduation. His smile was radiant, his eyes full of hope, so different from the man who had just walked out of her life. Nestled between the pages of the album was a folded piece of paper. At first, Emily thought it was just another old note, perhaps a shopping list or a letter. But when she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was Eleanor's will, and it was addressed to her. Emily's hands trembled as she read the neatly written words. Eleanor had left everything, her house, her savings, and all her belongings, to Emily. The will stated that the inheritance was intended for Ethan's benefit, trusting Emily to use it wisely for her son. Eleanor had written, "I leave everything to Emily, my daughter-in-law, because I believe she will do what is best for my grandson. A mother knows how to care for her child, and I trust her completely." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she read those words. She felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for Eleanor's faith in her, sorrow for the loss of a woman who had shown her kindness, and a renewed sense of responsibility to honor this trust. For the first time in days, Emily felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this was the lifeline she and Ethan needed to start anew. That evening, Emily called her closest friend, Jessica. Jessica had been a pillar of support for Emily through many difficult times, and she was married to Robert, a lawyer who could help navigate the legalities of the inheritance. When Jessica arrived later that night, Emily showed her the will. "This is incredible," Jessica said, her voice a mix of astonishment and admiration. "Eleanor really believed in you, Emily. And she was right, you're the best person to make sure Ethan gets the life he deserves." Emily smiled weakly, still overwhelmed. "But do you think James will try to fight this? What if he finds out?" Jessica's expression grew serious. "We'll need to handle this carefully. Robert will know how to make sure everything is in order." Don't worry, this is legally sound. And you have people who will stand by you. Over the next few weeks, Robert helped Emily through the process of claiming the inheritance. It wasn't without its challenges, paperwork, meetings, and the constant fear that James might find out and cause trouble. Emily did her best to focus on Ethan and the future, reminding herself that this was all for him. When James finally learned about the will, his reaction was predictably angry. He accused Emily of stealing what was rightfully his, claiming the house was part of his childhood and should have been his. But Eleanor's will was clear, and there was nothing he could do to change it. One day, James showed up at the house in Vermont while Emily was visiting to sort through its contents. He was disheveled and reeked of alcohol, his once sharp features now marred by anger and bitterness. He confronted Emily, yelling about how unfair it was that she had taken everything from him. Emily stood her ground, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "Your mother left this to me because she knew it was the best way to protect Ethan," she said firmly. "This isn't about you or me, it's about our son." James didn't respond. Instead, he stormed off, his footsteps echoing on the gravel driveway as he disappeared into the night. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy with a mix of pity and relief. She knew then that James was no longer the man she had married, and any hope of reconciliation was gone. With the house and funds secured, Emily began to make plans for her and Ethan's future. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of direction. Eleanor's final gift had given her the means to provide for her son, and Emily was determined to honor that legacy. Emily spent the weeks after her confrontation with James focused on turning Eleanor's house into something more than just a symbol of inheritance. It was going to be a home for her and Ethan. A fresh start. The small Vermont house, nestled in a quiet village, offered the kind of peace Emily desperately needed. Its cozy charm, despite its worn edges, reminded her of simpler times, a life untainted by heartbreak and betrayal. For Ethan, it was a new world to explore. Emily took care to set up his room in a way that would bring him comfort and joy. She filled it with soft blankets, his favorite toys, and a large window where he could watch the birds outside. The boy, though bound to his wheelchair, had a gentle spirit that made Emily's heart ache with both love and sorrow. He didn't complain about his condition, but Emily often wondered what he truly felt. Unable to express himself as other children did, she made a vow to give him the best life she could, regardless of the challenges. Jessica and Robert continued to be an unwavering source of support. Jessica helped Emily organize the house while Robert handled the remaining legalities. "You've got this, Emily," Jessica said one afternoon as they folded curtains together. "I can see it already, this place is going to feel like home in no time." Emily smiled faintly, her mind still clouded with lingering doubts. I don't know if I'm strong enough for all of this," she admitted. "Some days, it feels like I'm barely holding on." Jessica placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. You've got me, Robert, and Ethan. We'll get through this together." As Emily worked on settling into her new life, she couldn't help but think of James. She had loved him deeply once, and part of her still clung to the memory of the man he used to be, the one who had held her hand during Ethan's birth, who had laughed with her over late-night movies, and who had once shared her dreams for the future. But those memories were now overshadowed by the bitterness of his betrayal. Emily tried not to dwell on it, focusing instead on the present. She started a small garden in the backyard, planting flowers and vegetables with the hope that nurturing something new would bring her some peace. Ethan sat in his wheelchair nearby, watching intently as Emily dug into the soil. "Do you like it, Ethan?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. The boy smiled faintly, and Emily felt a flicker of hope. "This is for us," she said softly, more to herself than to Ethan. A fresh start. But even as Emily worked tirelessly to build a better life, James wasn't entirely gone from her thoughts or her life. He began calling sporadically, his voice slurred and full of anger. Each time, Emily declined his calls, unwilling to let him drag her back into the chaos she had worked so hard to escape. His attempts to reach her grew more desperate, and Emily couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly let go. One evening, as she sat in the living room sorting through another bag of Eleanor's belongings, she found a diary. It was one of Eleanor's, filled with reflections from her later years. Emily read through the entries, finding comfort in the older woman's words. Eleanor had written about her hopes for her grandson, her fears for James, and her quiet admiration for Emily's strength. Emily will do what's right, one entry read. She has a kind heart and a fierce love for her child. I trust her completely. Those words stayed with Emily long after she closed the diary. They reminded her that, even when she doubted herself, someone had seen her strength and believed in her. It gave her the courage to face each new day, no matter how difficult. Still, James' presence loomed in the background like a shadow that wouldn't fade. One day, he showed up at the Vermont house unannounced. Emily was startled to find him sitting on the bench outside the gate, looking disheveled and broken. His hair was unkempt, his clothes rumpled, and his eyes were bloodshot. Emily hesitated, her instincts telling her to stay away. But she couldn't ignore him completely. "Why are you here, James?" she asked, keeping her distance. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of sadness and defiance. "This is my house too," he said bitterly. "At least, it used to be. You've taken everything." Emily's heart hardened at his words. "Your mother left it to me for Ethan's sake," she replied firmly. "This isn't about you or me, James. It's about our son." James scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't care about that anymore." Hearing those words hurt, but Emily refused to let him see her pain. She stood her ground, watching as he eventually walked away, muttering under his breath. That moment solidified something in Emily. She couldn't waste any more energy on James. Her focus had to be on the future, on Ethan, and on the life she was building. And so, she turned her back on the past and stepped back into the house, ready to face whatever came next. Despite James' abrupt visit, Emily remained determined to protect the life she was rebuilding for herself and Ethan. Yet, the encounter left a lingering unease. James' words, though bitter and slurred with resentment, had reopened old wounds. Emily tried to push the memories aside, but they crept back during quiet moments: his laughter, their shared dreams, and the promise of a life they had once built together. Emily channeled her emotions into creating a stable routine for Ethan. She spent her mornings caring for him, afternoons tending to the garden, and evenings poring over Eleanor's belongings. The task of sorting through the past became a therapeutic ritual, a way to connect with the woman who had shown her unwavering kindness. Eleanor's diaries, in particular, were a source of solace. They painted a picture of a strong, compassionate woman who had faced her own share of hardships yet never lost her faith in love and family. One evening, Emily came across an entry that struck a deep chord. "Sometimes, life demands sacrifices we don't feel ready to make. But if it's for the ones we love, it's always worth it." Those words lingered in her mind as she thought of Ethan. Everything she was doing, every sleepless night, every moment of self-doubt, was for him. She would sacrifice anything to ensure he had a future. Yet, James remained a shadow in their lives. His calls became less frequent but more erratic. Sometimes, he left angry voicemails accusing Emily of stealing his mother's legacy. Other times, his messages were tinged with regret and vague apologies. Emily ignored them all. She couldn't afford to let him back into their lives, not when she was finally finding a semblance of peace. But James wasn't done. A few weeks after his visit to the Vermont house, Emily received a call late at night. She hesitated before answering, bracing herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. "Emily," James said, his voice low and shaky, "we need to talk. There's nothing to talk about, she replied firmly. Please stop calling. You think you're better off without me. Don't you? He spat. You don't understand what I've been through. Emily's hand tightened around the phone. What you've been through, she repeated, her voice trembling with anger. James. You abandoned us. You left your son, your sick son, because you couldn't handle your own pain. Don't you dare try to make me feel guilty. For a moment. There was silence. Then James sighed heavily. I made mistakes, he admitted. But you don't know what it's like to lose everything. My business. My mother, it broke me. Emily. And what about me? She countered. Her voice breaking. Do you think I haven't lost anything? Do you think I don't feel broken every single day? But I don't have the luxury of falling apart because I have Ethan. He's my world. James. He should have been yours too. James didn't respond. After a long pause, he muttered, I'll leave you alone. Then he hung up. Emily sat in the dark for a long time, the phone still clutched in her hand. She wanted to feel relief, but all she felt was exhaustion. Every interaction with James drained her, pulling her back into the chaos she was trying so hard to escape. The next morning, Emily resolved to focus entirely on Ethan. She arranged for a therapist to visit the house and work with him on mobility exercises, hoping to improve his quality of life. The therapist, a kind woman named Claire, quickly became a source of encouragement for both mother and son. Ethan is a remarkable boy, Claire said after one session, smiling warmly. He's resilient. Just like his mother. Emily felt tears prick her eyes at the compliment. I'm just doing my best, she said softly. And that's more than enough. Claire replied. With Claire's help, Ethan began making small but significant progress. He responded more to Emily's words, his smiles growing brighter and more frequent. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like they were moving forward. But James' shadow was never far away. One evening, as Emily prepared dinner, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a picture posted on social media, a photo of James with another woman. They were smiling on a sunny balcony, his arm draped around her shoulders. The caption read, Starting fresh. Emily stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. Anger, sadness, and even a twinge of jealousy fought for dominance. But as she looked away from the photo and back at Ethan, who was giggling softly in his chair, she reminded herself of what truly mattered. James had chosen his path, and she had chosen hers. And in her path, there was no room for his chaos. She deleted the notification, took a deep breath, and carried on. The past was the past, and Emily was determined to keep it there. Emily woke the next morning feeling a sense of clarity. Seeing James' social media post had solidified her resolve to move forward without looking back. He had made his choices, and she refused to let his actions define her life or Ethan's. She poured her energy into creating a stable, nurturing environment for her son and continued her work on the Vermont house, which was slowly becoming their sanctuary. Ethan, with his gentle spirit, was her anchor. His laughter, though quiet and rare, brought warmth to their home. Claire, their therapist, had become a regular presence, and Emily saw small but encouraging improvements in Ethan's mobility and responses. It was these little victories that kept her going. But James wasn't done disrupting their lives. One evening, as Emily sat on the couch folding laundry while Ethan watched a cartoon, her phone buzzed with a call. It was James. She hesitated but answered, knowing that avoiding him hadn't stopped his interference. Emily, James said, his voice tense. I'm outside. Let me in. We need to talk. Panic surged through her. She walked to the window and peeked through the curtain, expecting to see him at the gate. Instead, the yard was empty. You're not outside, she said, her voice shaking. I'm in the building, he replied, his tone chillingly calm. If you don't open the door, I'll break it down. Fear gripped her as she realized he was serious. She immediately hung up and called Jessica, her hands trembling. Jessica picked up after a few rings, her voice filled with concern. "Emily, what's going on?" "James is here," Emily said, her voice trembling. "He's threatening to break in." Jessica's response was immediate. "Call the police." "I'll be there as soon as I can." Emily hung up and dialed the police, trying to keep her voice steady as she explained the situation. As she waited for help to arrive, she heard the heavy thuds of James pounding on the door. Ethan, sensing her distress, began to whimper softly. She quickly wheeled him into the bedroom and locked the door before returning to the living room. The banging continued, each sound echoing through the small house. Emily braced herself, not knowing what James might do next. Minutes felt like hours. But finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the tense silence. The banging stopped abruptly, and she heard James muttering angrily before the front door creaked open. She hadn't realized it was unlocked, and her stomach dropped. The police arrived just as James stepped inside. They apprehended him without incident. But Emily could see the fury in his eyes as they led him away. The officers assured her he wouldn't be allowed near her again. But Emily's nerves were frayed. Jessica arrived shortly after, wrapping Emily in a tight hug and helping her calm down. "Why can't he just leave us alone?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jessica squeezed her hand. "Because he's lost control. And he can't stand seeing you move on. But you're stronger than him. Emily, you've already proven that." In the following weeks, James' actions had consequences. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for violating the protection order Emily had filed against him. The chaos he had brought into her life finally began to fade, leaving Emily with the space she needed to heal. Emily threw herself into the life she was building for Ethan. She spent hours teaching him to communicate with simple gestures. And with Claire's help, he began to show remarkable progress. Emily also focused on herself, finding joy in small things, reading a book, tending the garden, or simply sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the quiet Vermont countryside. Months later, Emily returned to Eleanor's diaries. She read through them slowly, savoring the wisdom and love within their pages. One entry struck her deeply: "Life will always test us. But it's in the tests that we discover our strength. Never forget that you are capable of more than you think." As Emily closed the diary, she realized how far she had come. The pain James had caused no longer defined her. Instead, her life was now shaped by the love she had for Ethan and the resilience she had found within herself. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Emily stepped outside to the garden, where Ethan was sitting in his wheelchair, watching the birds. She knelt beside him, taking his small hand in hers. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, a smile spreading across her face. "We've got everything we need right here." Ethan looked at her and smiled. And in that moment, Emily knew she had found her way back to hope. Emily's journey was one of resilience, love, and finding strength in the face of unimaginable hardships. Though life had tested her in ways she never expected, she emerged stronger, not just for herself but for her son, Ethan. The Vermont house became more than a place to live, it was a sanctuary where she and Ethan could thrive. With the support of friends like Jessica and Claire, and the wisdom left behind by Eleanor, Emily learned to let go of the past and embrace the future with hope. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest times, love and perseverance can light the way. If you've found this story inspiring, please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more heartfelt tales that celebrate the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video of Life Stories.